Hello everyone, my name's Izora. I'm a black feminist and I'm a member of the Radical Girls. I'll be moderating this webinar on behalf of the Radical Girls today. We'll have the questions and answers section after all the speakers have spoken. And so now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Noura Rad. Noura is a Lebanese feminist based in France. She has a PhD in criminal law and she is the co-president of the European Network of Migrant Women. Thank you, Noura.
Thank you, Azura. Thank you. Before starting, I would like to thank the European Network of Migrant Women. Thank you, Anna, Adriana, and everyone who worked to organize this webinar. I would like also to thank speakers and people who are attending the webinar. Radical Girls, of course, for their contribution. I think it's very important to show our common struggle as young women and radical feminists. I would like also to thank a lot SIAMs for their enormous work and essential for the protection of women and girls, all feminists from Spain, Ukraine, Latin America for their courage, daily struggle, and I would like to thank Julie Bindle for her presence. It's an honor for us to have you and to listen to you. So this year, for the 25th of November, our network, the European Network of Migrant Women, decided to focus on a form of violence that affects migrant women, their bodies, their integrity, and make them an object of exploitation and commodification. I'm talking about surrogacy, which is comparable to prostitution in the system of exploitation of women. We published our paper, our position paper on this subject in the 25th. We will explain it today through this webinar, and then I will let experts to present concrete cases, their work, and their strategies to fight this form of violence against women. Before presenting the reason why surrogacy is a violence against women and their bodies, let's give a definition of this practice. Surrogacy, or substitute motherhood, is the loaning of women's bodies in order to give birth to children who will be given to people who ordered them. From this definition, I suggest to take this practice to compare it to prostitution and think about its consequences on women. First, as in prostitution, surrogacy can never be the subject of a contract. Why? Because there is no free or informed consent. In a contract, we need two adults who have legal capacity, who are willing to come to an agreement on a legal object. However, in surrogacy, same as in prostitution, we are speaking about loaning a woman's body to give birth. It is a consent to say yes, so that a woman's body is rent and used for third parties, and is their consent when women are forced for different reasons to undergo this act. So same as in prostitution, no consent for price rape, for exploitation, no freedom of choice, it's not a job and cannot be contracted. Secondly, women used in surrogacy cannot know in advance the consequences of pregnancy nor of childbirth. So once again, consent does not exist and cannot exist in this kind of practice. Thirdly, surrogacy concerns a human body. The main object of the contract is a human body, and it's used for the benefit of people who order the child, which is not possible and which is illegal. It's a violation of the principle of non-commercialization of the human body. Finally, the object also of this contract is not only about using women's body, but also the commodification of children who are sold and bought. It's a human rights violation again. So, if we compare it to prostitution, same reasoning, same strategies are used to sell women's bodies. In both cases, women's bodies are exploited for the pleasure of others who order and who mainly are men. They are commodified, and all this while arguing that this practice has a social utility, that consent exists, and that women are free of their choices. But about which choice are we talking? Using and renting a woman's body is a choice. Selling and buying children are a real choice. The fact of using the purest women as in prostitution is a choice. Giving a body for financial reason is a choice. Of course not. The exploitation of a human body is not a choice and cannot be the subject of a contract. So surrogacy cannot be contracted. Secondly, in surrogacy, as in prostitution, women are the only victims used, exploited in this practice to satisfy the desires of others. This practice is implemented by human reproduction companies, as in prostitution, by trafficking networks. So it's a whole organized reproduction system, including laboratories, doctors, agencies, etc. This system, therefore, uses women because they are the only resource for the reproduction industry. They are only commodities. This explains why, as in prostitution, women who are used in this practice are the most vulnerable, women from the poorest countries, migrant women, of course. And in addition to the exploitation and commodification of migrant women's bodies, children are also sold and bought in this practice. So there is no difference between a human being, a person, and an object. And they are ultimately migrant children who are sold and bought. Once again, we are facing a violence and a sexual exploitation that affect first migrant women and make them more vulnerable. As in prostitution, migrant women are trafficked to be used in this industry. And we can see it today, all of us. And I think that other feminists will explain it, and Siams will explain it better than me by giving a concrete cases, but we can, for example, see it together, see it today when we are working to fight prostitution and trafficking. We see that women who are, for example, in my work, women who are victims of trafficking, especially from Bulgarian women who are victims of trafficking, are at the same time used for surrogacy. They are exploited in surrogacy. When they get pregnant, they take their children. We don't know where the children are. It's just about social assistants who they are noticing that always there are men who are with these women in hospital, and that after that they come to abort or to have another child, and they say that they don't have any children. They didn't have any children before. So we know that this is happening in France and everywhere, and we need more proof to react and to do something. Without speaking also on physical and psychological consequences of this practice on women, on the fact that they don't have any right, that they are just used to give birth. Sometimes they are forced to keep babies if people who own these babies change their mind. We are not talking about a human being here. It's a commercialization of a body and an object. So to summarize about our position paper on surrogacy and why we think it's important and why it's a violence against women. At the legal level, principles of a human dignity, the non-commercialization of a human body, the protection of women, their bodies, and their integrity are the principle on which we rely to claim the abolition of surrogacy. In addition to the legal framework and on the base of our feminist analysis, same as in prostitution, surrogacy is only a way to exploit women, to use them in a reproductive industry, to commodify them, to use their bodies, by making them believe that it's their freedom of choice and decision. It's a practice that comes directly from the patriarchal system and the capitalism, which had the same origins, same strategies for exploiting women, their bodies, and the same consequences. It's about an exploitation of women because of their sex, and especially migrant women. This is why, in the context of our fight against violence against women, we as a network, we reaffirm our abolitionist feminist position. We recognize that surrogacy is a violence against women, and we demand the abolition of this practice. In the name of our human dignity, for the protection of our rights, for the protection of our daughters' rights and bodies, we must fight this violence, which affects thousands of vulnerable, precarious migrant women. We must act against lobbies and who are demanding legalization in the name of freedom of choice.
I'd now like to welcome the next speaker, Anna Daram. She's a French-Romanian activist of women's rights. She's a member of the collective pour le respect de la personne and a co-chair and co-founder of the International Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogate Motherhood. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nora. You already said all it's important to say. So I'm here in my capacity as one of the 3 co-chairs of the International Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogate Motherhood. And I'm very happy to be with you today. It's very good to hear radical feminists. I would like to briefly present you our initiative as an international coalition, which is an international convention to abolish the practice of surrogacy motherhood. Why do we want this? Because we consider, as you say it, Nura, that surrogacy from the feminist perspective can be only abolished and not regulated. Regulating a practice based on violence against women is unacceptable. Surrogacy involves medical, obstetric, psychological, social, and economic violence. They are known and they are recognized because surrogacy contracts provide for compensation to offset their effects on women's health and lives. I give here only one example, excerpt from one American contract of surrogacy, and we can see in this contract the terms employed, like physical and personal injury, medical risks, death, pregnancy complication, psychological risks. So all this belongs to surrogacy. Since so regulating is unacceptable from a feminist point of view, however, the regulation is on. Since 2010, the Hague Conference on Private International Law has been taking steps to regulate surrogacy, which is generating, as we all know, a flourishing market for medically assisted reproduction. The general purpose of the Hague Conference is to harmonize the rules of private law. Most of the countries in the world prohibit surrogacy, but the Hague Conference chose to support the market by ensuring the effectiveness of the consequences of the international contracts or international arrangements, otherwise to satisfy the clients. Or this market is only possible by exploiting women, exploiting their bodies, exploiting the product of their bodies. We should understand that everything is or should be for sale. The Hague Conference deliberately ignores the violence made against women in this practice. They simply ignore women's rights. For its regulation project, the conference carried out a consultation in order to know the reality of the practice. And during this consultation, they chose to address questionnaires to the states, to the legal practitioners, to the health practitioners, and to the surrogacy agencies. So they consulted those who benefit from the market and those who have to regulate the market. But no women's rights NGO was consulted, which is not a surprise. Why? Because the Hague Conference is inspired by the Bible. As we can see it on the preliminary report from 2012, in this report, as you can see it, they clearly say surrogacy is not a new concept. Traditional surrogacy arrangement can be traced back to biblical times, which is very good for the women condition, as we know already. And the example they choose is a biblical episode, the one with Rachel and Jacob, in which they don't even name the woman who gets pregnant and who carries the baby and who gives them life. So for the Hague Conference, surrogate mother don't even deserve to be named. If we have to refer to this biblical episode in contemporary words, maybe you should choose some words like rape, forced pregnancy, slavery. Instead of all this, the Hague Conference chose to speak about traditional surrogacy arrangement. So they ignore women and women's rights because since 2050, women's rights NGOs have written to the conference every year. No reply. Women's rights and women's human rights are never taken into consideration, nor is the violence against them. Instead, the same year, the Permanent Bureau of the conference has set up a group of experts. This group of experts working on to develop an international regulatory instrument met in early October this year and continues to make progress on this project. The two consultants to the Permanent Bureau on this project on surrogacy are two British lawyers specialized in surrogacy. Is there any conflict of interest? Who knows? What is sure is that one of them is the one who wrote the preliminary report, you know, the one inspired by the Bible. All these informations are public. You can find them on the site of the Hague Conference. So the only interests defended by the Hague Conference are those of the market and of its clients. This is why the feminist answer to surrogacy is abolition. The surrogacy market the Hague Conference wants to regulate is based on reproductive exploitation and on violence against women. As we know, there is a definition of the violence against women. I give you only one example why it is violence, because as we can see in a medical research, this is an article wrote after medical research with surrogate American mothers. This practice supposes many risks for the women's health. So our answer is a convention, an international convention to abolish surrogacy. You can find our convention on our site. We launched the call a few weeks ago to ask for support for this convention, and today we are more than 2,050 feminist and women's rights NGO who sign it from more than 50 countries. Our purposes are to reaffirm the principles that human body cannot be subject of conventions or contracts, to, of course, recognize surrogacy as a violence against women, and to recognize also that surrogacy is always contrary to the interest of the child, and to prohibit surrogacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'd now like to welcome Teresa Ulloa, who is a feminist campaigner in Mexico and the first woman lawyer to defend women's reproductive and sexual rights in Mexican court. She's the regional director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over to you, Teresa.
Good morning to all of you. Here in this side of the world, it is too early for us. And I want to share with you the Latin American Manifesto against reproductive exploitation of women. More than 100 NGOs and feminist abolitionist organizations and collectives worried because of the reiterated and extended intents of our governments and congresses to regulate the commercial surrogacy, were able to get together and draft a manifesto that gathered our worries and demands, which was presented last November 11 with the participation of more than 3,500 participants. We organized to oppose any legislation or legislative initiatives in our country aimed at legalizing or regulating the reproductive exploitation of women based on their sex in its various forms by the contractual practice commonly known as worms for rent and referred to by its proponents as surrogate motherhood, surrogate pregnancy, or surrogate gestation, or uterus for rent, as well as oocyte donation for commercial purposes. The practice of surrogate motherhood, we decided we see this practice as an unambiguous manifestation of discrimination, violence, and violation of the human and fundamental rights of women, girls, and boys. It is contrary to the provisions of the international conventions and treaties to which our countries are signatories and whose observance is mandatory by virtue of a constitutional mandate. The rights likely to be undermined in this way are defined by the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, and the optional protocol to the Convention of the Rights of Child on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Well, surrogacy is not, and this is very important, is not a technique insofar as gestation and childbirth by a woman who is going to relinquish the child born and hand it over to third parties by order and contract, does not in any way reverse or cure the infertility or sterility of the contracting person. A woman's pregnancy at the request of a third party to whom she must hand over the child she is carrying and giving birth forces that woman to renounce her fundamental rights and usurps those of the child she is giving birth to. It is a contractual relationship characterized by almost systemic social and economic inequality between the contracting parties because of their sex. Women are regarded as consumer products and instruments for satisfying the desires of others. In these practices, women's reproductive capacities are exploited through an exchange of money or any other remuneration or compensation in a context of economic and social inequality between the parties, which affects women's decision to be reduced to the status of gestor or oocyte donors. The practice in any of its so-called contractual forms, altruistic or commercial, undermines the right to filiation of women who conceive and give birth, regardless of the genetic relationship with the child, since any regulation in this area is a contract which forces women to renounce their fundamental right to filiation in order to transfer it to third parties. Presented as false progressism, the notions of freedom and desire underlying the discourse promoting the legislation of surrogacy are in fact part of a neoliberal and postmodern postulate which relies on the alleged individual freedom of women engaged as gestors to legitimize the restriction of their human and fundamental rights on the basis of their sex, while disregarding the structural inequality which conditions their decision in a context of family and social pressure, the feminization of poverty, and the systematic economic and social exclusion and marginalization in which half of the population finds itself. Surrogacy contracts are a form of imposed, controlled, highly medicalized, and high risk maternity, transforming healthy women into functional patients to satisfy the wishes of others, which may include hypermedical treatments, the transfer of several embryons, embryon reduction procedures, or induced abortions without taking into account the desires of the surrogate mothers, the choice of mode of delivery, and psychological therapies for dissociation from the fetus. These are acts of medical, obstetric, and psychological violence against these women, to which should be added frequent medical visits and clinical tests, control of daily life, sleep, diet, physical activity, movement, or sexual activity. Well, here you can see our main requests in the manifesto are 8. Mainly, we are worried about the reproductive tourism to the global south, European migrant women network. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I would now like to welcome Patricia Ponce, who's an Argentinian feminist campaigner based in Spain. She's the founder and director of Heralde Foundation, member organization in the European Network of Migrant Women, and has extensive experience in advocating for the rights of migrant women in Europe. The floor is yours, Patricia.
I like to speak, thank you too much, of course, the European Network of Migrant Women, that we are part of this space, and the other organization who promote this is speak, no? Because it's very important in this moment in the world. Well, I like to speak about surrogacy of rather barely renting of one more form of intersecting violence. We think is intersecting violence after we can speak about this. The misnamed surrogate gestation is a violation of human rights. It must be analyzed as an exploitation of body and children, a service contract in which international standards for the protection of children and a specific norm of biotics and breach. As we will see later from feminists, we prefer to use the denomination belief renting or uterus renting. The rental of uterus has international cross-border partners. There are parents from rich countries and pregnant mother from impoverished countries. The recruitment of expectant mother is there before carried out in impoverished countries, although there is talk of the free consent of mother, but we will see how this is not the case. To speak of free consent, this must be an information and free act, and neither one nor not the other occurs in commercial gestation. Consent requires an autonomous self, not mediated by survivor or subordination, which is what happened with improvisation women and or immigration women, as Laura Nuño tells us. There can be consent is a patriarchal system in which one part of self-institutions and a subject or the other in designing as an object, a womb or a basket. Which is the difference between use and abuse when there is a relationship or power and another of need. When women from the global south militate and fight in our countries against the extractivists of natural resources and raw material from impoverished countries to be sold in the international market, we must now add the bodies and women, each of the located market to buy eggs in one country and another the woman to start in a third sells the resulting products in different parts because we think it's extractivist of the body, the woman. What do we, women in vulnerable situation, immigrant women, women from the South faced? Abuse of surrogate belief or uterus rentals. Abusive practice ran from sex offenders in Israel and Australia who entrusted children to mother in India and Thailand. There before the additional protocol to the Convention of the Human Rights of the Child, we just talked about this protocol before my friend before, is breached, which have been signed and ratified by most countries. Pedophiles and abusers naked throats deviant than this exploit practice alone. I know that is in this meeting, and this Jane Sarson as speaking no, and she stayed in this webinar. I saw in the list, and I think she combined with me with about this. Well, the traffic of surrogate mothers across borders, the above change in legislation. In the state assume a clear commitment to the prevention and eradication of trafficking in children and women. The starting point should be prohibition of surrogacy, which first gives rise to the slavery of women to give birth, and they too, the of body and girl who can earn and begin sales, since the one to pay decide to produce to buy. This violent to the United protocols to prevent surprises and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. I argue that uterus rental is a form of reproductive extractivism. It takes advantage of a situation of extreme need of broad layer on the population, hiding behind supports free will of the woman hired to gestate, and is based of the cooperation of government using, as in the export of goods and resources from impoverished countries, the legal limbos. The order of the subs are reducing the bodies for pleasures in prostitution and for gestation and reproduction. They are thought of a womb's land from which fruit are plucked. Mammals violently separated from their creatures, organic fluid, waiting pay organized and distributed by the instrumental reason of neocolonial powers vessels. This is a cita from Alicia Puello. The red mother is required to disassociate. She is asked not to create a link with the baby that her body is carrying, and there is hardly a talk about the impact of the mental health of this woman in this part, and the sexual and reproductive rights of the rented mother are violated, since there are not clauses in the contract that guarantee postpartum health, or in the case of cancerous section or complication in childbirth, the branches are 12 of CEDAW, and General Recommendation 24, where the obligation to safeguard women's health right. This is not the situation in this case. There is not harmonized legislation, and despite the fact to the European Parliament in the resolution PATA considered its universal provision as contrary to the human dignity of women, since their body and their reproductive functions are used as a raw material. The practice continues, and is in the Spanish case, girls and body slip into the legislation through the back door, since embassy and consulate in short country kiss children. Authors such as Silvia Federici plan with a various feminists for this relocation of the body of South women. However, this is not the problem, since the heterosexual couples with fertility problems or gays with resources are in this time the great demand. It will seem that there is a difficulty on the part of these academic feminists in naming emerging minority collective that have been historically stigmatized.
I'd now like to welcome Alasia Sagaidak, a lesbian radical feminist and a country contact for the Women's Human Rights Campaign in Ukraine. She's a journalist and is experienced in advocacy for the rights of lesbian and gay persons living with HIV and children with difficult life circumstances. The floor is yours, Alasia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Surrogacy is really complex issues we can see, and thank you everyone for clarifying everything so perfectly. Concerning Ukraine, I want to firstly dive into general situation for your understanding. Commercial surrogacy has been officially allowed in Ukraine since 1997, but it doesn't mean that society fully accepts this. But media desperately tries to make surrogacy look as if it's something modern, progressive, relevant, and close to being holy to be surrogate mother or support this industry. If you try to Google surrogacy in Ukraine in any language, but especially in Ukrainian or Russian, you will meet about 8-10 advertisements before you can reach to an actual articles. But even those articles are mostly PR texts of clinics who are trying to promote their services and engage women into being exploited. They portray surrogacy as if it's helping people who cannot have children. The interviews of the mothers who share their struggles because of the surrogacy are a pretty rare occasion. They usually define surrogacy as surrogacy is the only way for women who have no uterus or suffer from serious illnesses to get a genetically native child. As we can clearly see, they switch a focus from surrogate mothers to those who exploit them. The only institute who vehemently disagrees with this policy is the church and some pro-life organizations who believe that pregnancy can be done only one way. The biggest issue with the opposition lies in their deepest belief that those women who do surrogacy are the problem. Simply, they shame women, but not the buyers and businessmen who found it. But there are some anarchist organizations too who have agendas similar to what we say here. The average price for the services are from 6,000 euros to 30,000 euros, with the average salary in Ukraine hanging between 200, 400 euros. Many women are forced by the circumstances to find a way to feed and build the future for their children. As a doctor reproductologist says herself, it's a typical case for surrogate mothers to be highly educated women who work as teachers, nurses, engineers, etc., but don't get enough money for a living. So in the minds of women, what could be better than to have a good salary and at the same time helping people, making a holy deed? The biggest surrogacy company here is Biotech.com. The founder of it is Albert Tachulowski, a German citizen who also has a Moldovan citizenship and only a residence permit in Ukraine. That's why Ukrainian surrogacy is so popular in Germany. The main traffic of children goes exactly in this country. That's how Albert himself talks about surrogacy in the interview. Quote, "Average woman's salary is half of the official salary, which is 4,000 hryvnias, about 140 euros. For this tiny salary, they're being fully exploited. Try to feed your family with this amount of money. Surrogacy and egg donation is a highly paid job. I'm also talking about the fact that these are holy deeds. A new life is born. It's beautiful and useful." Unquote. In Germany, surrogacy is banned, so our government does everything to protect, guess who? The buyers. The Ministry of International Affairs have never monitored how many Germans buy kids. And of course, there is no data of the buyers, who are they, what motive they have, etc. In 2018, one journalist decided to investigate the industry from inside. She pretended to be a surrogate mother and immediately pointed out that they barely suggested any tests before giving her birth control pills and other medicine. Clinics are mostly remain semi-hidden. They usually don't even have a signboard. Workers don't have pages. To how many children are being trafficked, the Ministry of Justice gives only approximate numbers. In 2019, Ukrainian surrogate mothers gave birth to 1,496 children for foreigners. And in 2018, 1,095 children. However, some real numbers may be higher and will be higher because surrogate mothers often go abroad to give birth to the kids. Now I'm going to cross-linkages. With everything being said, it very logically delivers us to cross-linkages with prostitution. Not only that people are again justifying it with consent, as if you're signing a contract and getting a salary, it's not an exploitation anymore, completely ignoring the circumstances. We can also observe that women in poverty are being exploited, same as in prostitution. Same as in prostitution, in the countries where it's legal, it's being promoted as a normal way to make money, highly engaging women into an exploitation. All the struggles that this industry will deliver to a woman remain unspoken. Not only that surrogacy is making women's bodies an object of service, an incubator, but also it's a pure exploitation of a reproductive labor. On top of it, it makes children an actual product that you can buy. This is dehumanization in a nutshell. This industry, along with the prostitution, also monetizes the natural functions and elements of our bodies, causing physical problems that come with often pregnancies, pills that you have to take, etc., and also mental, same as for the mother and for the baby. Many women are struggling with depression, crisis from giving their child to someone else, many kids trying to find their real mothers after they found out the truth. Surrogacy causing the growth of the objectivization of women's bodies, and this objectivization which liberal society is so desperately trying to fight against. It also reminds me on how prostitution and pornography tries to split the mind from the body, e.g. it's happening to my body, not to me, and how women suffer from self-harm, inner aggression, and not infrequently eventually ends up with suicide because they don't feel their bodies belong to them. Surrogacy protects the buyers like they had no choice, saying that those people just desperately want to have a family, to have kids, but shaming women like they had a choice, same as prostitution. Moreover, with this industry being unmonitored, we can only hope for well-being of the children, since many Ukrainian kids are being sex trafficked too. Without being said that in Germany, the main country of traffic, sex industry is one of the biggest and normalized. Moreover, the fact that recently were discovered lots of cases of pedophilia and adoption parenthood in Germany, since again, pedophiles are being protected, not potential victims. And unlikely to adoption, there is no chance for a mother or any people in charge of the surrogacy to make justice and help children to avoid their buyers when it's needed, because we don't have like in Russia, they have a law that allows mother to keep her child. In Ukraine, we don't have it. A mother is an object, is an incubator. She doesn't have any rights. In addition to it, many children are left abandoned by the buyers and thrown in an orphanage due to diseases or just because the buyers changed their mind. In conclusion, only the same Nordic model can help to fight against this issue. But first, the issue must be considered so. It has to be portrayed in its true colors and stop from being unspoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alesia. I'll now introduce our last speaker, Julie Bindle, who's a UK feminist campaigner against male violence towards women and girls and an international journalist. The floor is yours, Julie.
I'd just like to say, first of all, how inspired I am by Radical Girls and how deeply satisfying it is to see those proved wrong that insist that young women are buying the neoliberal nonsense about sex work is work and everything's a choice for women, and they're actually taking a proper feminist stand on the issues that affect women globally. So thank you for your work. And I'd just like to say that from my experience investigating and campaigning against the surrogacy trade and surrogacy per se, including altruistic surrogacy, is that it is by definition womb trafficking, because it always involves exploitation and a relative lack of choice for the women, even if they have opted to do this for non-commercial reasons. And the first thing I'd like to say is to contextualize surrogacy within patriarchy and the way that we as girls and women are socialized and pressurized to do things to please others, particularly men. And I think that this has led to a lot of women feeling that the rights of childless couples or individuals are paramount to theirs. And of course, we know that no one has the right to a child. There is no such right, and nor should there be. But when we hear some of the apologists for the surrogacy trade, you would really think it's about human rights of oppressed minorities, such as gay men, or even single men who have recently been defined by the World Health Organization as infertile. This is beyond belief. So gay male couples who wish to have a baby and who've decided that the hard-won rights for same-sex couples to adopt and foster children that are abandoned is now passé because they can grow their own child to order, has become a big problem, because the so-called human rights of gay men have been used as a smokescreen, which then further suggests that it is anti-gay, bigoted, prejudiced, or even homophobic to criticise gay men using surrogacy and using the wombs of surrogate mothers for their own convenience. The altruistic surrogate also can suffer terrible harm in this process, because of course often she is accused of abandoning her baby, as opposed to the woman undergoing a commercial surrogacy arrangement who is accused of selling her baby. And we have to remember that further down the line, there is a child and then an adult who will be questioning this and asking about their mother. So we've heard from our excellent speakers about the links between prostitution and surrogacy. Well, they're irrefutable because, of course, this is about wealthy, privileged people mining the bodies of poor women, of women of colour, of desperate women. But we also can't forget that wherever there's a commercialisation of any body part of women, there is also a pimp, a third-party exploiter. And I've seen this in India when I was undercover in Gujarat, the surrogacy capital of India, India being one of the surrogacy capitals of the world, where as a 54-year-old woman, I presented as an infertile woman desperate for a child, and I was willing to go to any lengths to have that child. And I was told in the surrogacy clinics that the women were unlikely to decide to keep the baby because they were so impoverished, and that in many cases this was the only opportunity they had to feel their existing children. The women I was introduced to, on forms at least, in these clinics were illiterate, and many of them had husbands who were violent. But not once did the clinic say that this was a problem. And when I asked what would happen if, because I was undercover, asking to engage a surrogate mother for my own ends, I asked what would happen if there were instances of domestic violence during the pregnancy, because surely that might harm the baby, my baby that I was going to buy. I was told by the clinician that they had had one experience of this nature, that one of their surrogate mothers was in fact being beaten by her husband. And what she did to solve this problem, she told me, was to put the pregnant woman in a dormitory with 9 other pregnant surrogates to keep her away from the violent husband. And then, of course, she was returned to him as soon as she'd handed over the baby. These women are treated worse than milk cows. I've heard, further to the normalisation of surrogacy, that lesbians in the UK, for example, rich lesbians who are attending IVF clinics in order to undergo the process of pregnancy from an egg from either one of the women themselves or that they have purchased from usually a rich, conventionally attractive college student who sells her eggs, that they are being offered surrogacy services because, as one woman told me, often women are too busy to be pregnant and to go through childbirth. So this industry is built upon class, race, and sex oppression. It is where capitalism meets patriarchy in its most insidious form. Countries that are looking to regulate this industry by keeping an eye on how ethical the businesses that are brokering this are conducting themselves. This regulation is as useless as legalising or decriminalising the sex trade. It further normalises this abuse of women's bodies. It further normalises the trade in children, and it gives men a carte blanche permission to consider women's bodies as nothing but a workplace. We have to end surrogacy, not just the commercial side, but we have to denormalise the use of women's bodies for other people's convenience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you to all the other speakers for participating in this webinar. The growth of surrogacy is an issue for all women, no matter what age or background. As young feminists and migrant women, we recognise the levels of exploitation and how this impacts on women. In a world which capitalises on the exploitation of women, we, radical girls, believe it is imperative that young women are included in leading the way forward against all forms of violence against women. I believe we'll now move on to the question and answer section.
We all appreciate, as feminists, how difficult it must be for women who are raised to feel unfulfilled without their own birth child. I don't think that this can trump the rights of the woman, even if the potential surrogate is saying that this is something she chooses to do and wants to do. The physical and mental health effects on non-commercial surrogates, in other words, altruistic surrogates, is very well documented and profound. And in fact, it can be, with altruistic surrogacy, even more damaging to the woman to give up her child because there is an expectation that she might be still involved in the child's life because it's something nice she's done for someone else. And that in and of itself is extremely complex and painful for both child and mother. But I think that the bottom line should be for us as feminists that if you are unable to have your own child, then we have to find a way for women to accept that this is not the end of life, that this doesn't mean that there are not children who also need care, who have been abandoned or whose mothers are unable to look after them. And there is no right to have your own biological child.
To compare the suffering and to establish a hierarchy of the suffering for not being able to have a children. Julie Bindle just talked earlier about men, single men, who are considered by the World Health Organization like being infertile. So if we accept, we as a society, if we accept that a woman, for the reasons, the personal reasons and the way she feels, can have access to use some other woman's body, why not to accept it for a man? Why to choose to be discriminatory to men? And if we accept it for a woman who cannot have a children by her own because of health problems, why not to accept it for a woman who is healthy, but who is afraid to be pregnant? Are we going to organize a hierarchy of the human suffering for not being able to, at the moment, have a children? I don't think so. And by the way, we are not here to give answers to personal problems, but to analyze, to see the political significance of a social practice who is nourishing a whole market and a whole industry. So of course that persons, individually speaking, are doing choices by themselves. Our problem is the industry and the market problem. And of course, the one of the equality of treatment for all.
I agree with everyone, and I don't think there is a way to make it non-exploitative or a feminist act. But I think that, yeah, it's the thing that makes women want genetically native child is that root of patriarchy is family and like genetics and this cult of delivering genes throughout the generations. But I think that first, a woman who wants to use someone's uterus for to have a child should ask herself, why does she need exactly genetically native kid? Because looking at the numbers of the kids in the orphanage, we can clearly see we don't need any surrogacy. We don't even need to like give genetically native kids by being like simply pregnant. We have a lot of kids abandoned, and yeah, I just think that this is this like a stereotype that only genetically native kid can be your own kid or something, or maybe this is like a stigma, the inner stigma that you have.
Real right is not to have to be pregnant or to have children. The right is of the children to have a family. Therefore, any woman that is not able to get pregnant could be great if she can adopt a child that is abandoned, not to exploit the reproductive capacity of another woman to have a supposed right of have a child, because that right, that wish, that desire of being mother is not a right. The right is of the children to have a family.
But it's as crazy and as simple as I presented it. The World Health Organization have decided that for the purposes of the rights to create a family, that single men should be classified as infertile, as are gay men. So the concept of infertility has been taken away from a medical model regarding women's reproductive functions and ability to one of rights of men.
The problem is that concerning surrogacy, unlikely to adoption, we don't have any data because, again, in Germany, surrogacy is being illegal. So to protect the buyers, the Ministry of Affairs, International Affairs, they don't monitor it. They have no data to protect the buyers from, facing the actual sentence. But I'm more than sure this is happening because I know there were a lot of cases of not only from Ukraine, but from adopting children for sexual purposes, for child pornography, etc., or just an exploitation. So I'm more than sure this is not even a rare occasion to do so. And this is even easier than adoption because adoption is being monitored by government, by services, and surrogacy is not. So you're free to do whatever you want to your child that you bought.
There are persons who want a child and who try to have the child by themselves, and then who try by assisted medical reproduction, and who say that they do not want adoption because what they want is a child related genetically to them. And there are other persons who try hard to adopt and who finally can adopt a child. There is a real problem in countries like Ukraine, like Romania, where thousands of children are alone in orphanages. And the laws are very strict, and the children in orphanages are used by the human traffic networks. We have data on this. All these children could be, or at least many of them, could be adopted and have a family. there is a political problem. There is really a political problem. But not all the people who want to have a child want to adopt a child. And we can see, for instance, people who can have their own children, who get access to surrogacy. I will not cite name of celebrities who did this. People who already have children and who gave other children through surrogacy, not even trying to adopt or to have their own children. So yes, there is a link between them. And I think that in countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, where the gay couples and lesbian couples encounter real problems to adopt, there are some really political progress to made in order to open the access to adoption to all the couples and to people who are able to have a child, who want to have a child by adopting him or her. But surrogacy is to ban for everybody. And there is a link to some points.
In Latin America, we have found this industry as an industry that is profiting of poor women that, of course, during the recession that we are undergoing because of the COVID pandemic, will be very, very accelerated. So they, first of all, we have the industry for commercial oxytocin donation, and afterwards we have the a huge industry that is developing through the agencies that call their practice, their exploitation practice as a reproductive assisted technician, which is not. This is not. And we have several cases that pregnancy went wrong and they abandoned the women and the children, and the prices they are paying are very small to the women and will never pay all the damage they undergo after the baby is born because of the high hyper medicalization hormone and the huge amount of hormones they used to give to them. So they are often in packages, even packages in the beaches, in the touristic centers, to come to realize the dream of having a child. Even there are women of the global north that come to our beaches to contract a surrogate mother because they don't want to damage their figure or their body, because pregnancy is not like going to the supermarket and choose the articles they want to buy. And in the very bottom, our governments are willing to legislate to make it legal because they don't want to worry about producing job opportunities to poor women, the same as prostitution. They are not checking anything, only they come and by. We have legalized this practice only in 2 states of Mexico, and they have to limit to prohibit the babies are delivered or sold to foreigners. But the thing still happens and is offered widely in Europe and in Canada, in the USA, because it's cheaper in Latin America than in other parts of the world.
I like to say that in international adoption, the couple needs to pass an exam from the country. For example, in Spain, very rigorous. I don't know what happened in other country, but maybe it's similar. Like single mother or single man. But the man, the problem is a little big, because now in the moment, in general, the country closed the possibility that the man only can adopt them. For example, in India, it's not possible for the men. Or if they like, the country said, well, in the future, but time pass. No? And with this surrogacy is different. Because it's a contract, private contract, and no people, no state, no government, nobody, no social worker, nothing make some examination as the woman or the man. But the problem is not only for couple. The problem is sometimes one man's like to pay from utero from the woman. And what happened with this baby in the future? Where is it, this child? We don't know. I work in Adoption International, and for 7 years, we look what happened with this child. We contact with this child when first year, second, 3, 5, 6, 4, 5, 7 years. We look at this child in the future, but with the surrogacy, we didn't know what happened with the children in the future.